They underestimated him, dismissed him, and treated him like a fool, until he exposed a legal fraud right in front of the judge. The courtroom was already against him before he even spoke. Jared Calloway stepped forward, his suit a little too worn, his tie slightly off-center, but his posture was steady. He wasn't a lawyer, never claimed to be. He was just a man who refused to let his grandmother's home be stolen by a corporate machine that saw people as nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. Judge Walter Grayson peered over his glasses, the corners of his mouth twitching in something that wasn't quite a smirk, but wasn't far from it either. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel lightly on the bench. "Mr. Calloway, representing yourself." The question dripped with amusement. Jared met his gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." A chuckle echoed from the other side of the room. Bryce Sterling, the opposing attorney, adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate ease. A corporate bulldog with a track record of steamrolling small-time defendants, Sterling was here to do what he did best: win. And Jared? He wasn't even a challenge. "This should be quick," Sterling muttered under his breath to his assistant, who gave a knowing smile. Jared heard it. He was supposed to hear it. That was the point. But he kept his face still. He'd been counted out before. He knew what it felt like to be dismissed, underestimated. That's why he was here. The judge let out a sigh, flipping through a file. "This is a property dispute, correct? A foreclosure challenge?" Jared nodded. "Yes, sir. My grandmother's home." Grayson barely glanced at him. "And you believe you can argue this case against a seasoned attorney like Mr. Sterling?" Jared didn't flinch. "I don't believe, Your Honor." "I know." The courtroom went quiet. A few muffled chuckles came from the corporate side of the room, but there was something else too, something unspoken. The kind of silence that comes when someone unexpected refuses to back down. Judge Grayson shook his head. "Very well. Let's get on with it." But Jared wasn't just here to argue. He was here to win, and they had no idea what was coming. But the judge's skepticism was only the beginning. The real challenge was about to come from the man sitting across the aisle, the one who thought Jared had already lost. Bryce Sterling adjusted his tie with a smug smile. This was his playground: the courtroom, the rules, the strategy. He had crushed dozens like Jared Calloway before. A man with no degree, no firm backing him, no experience. This wasn't a case. It was a warm-up. Judge Grayson exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Sterling, you may proceed with your opening statement." Sterling rose with practiced ease, buttoning his jacket as he stepped toward the jury. His voice was smooth, confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple." He gestured toward Jared without even looking at him. "We have a man who refuses to accept reality. The property in question was rightfully acquired by my client through legal foreclosure. The law is clear. The facts are irrefutable. This is not about emotions. This is about contracts, deadlines, and obligations. My client followed the law. Mr. Calloway did not." A well-placed pause, a slow turn, then a casual shrug. "I sympathize. Losing a home is painful, but pain does not override legal responsibility. The numbers don't lie." He nodded once toward the judge and then took his seat, hands folded, as if the case was already over. Jared sat still, unmoved. He'd expected this. But as he rose from his seat, he caught the way Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. A man watching something he didn't believe would be worth his time. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen." Jared cleared his throat, voice steady. "Mr. Sterling is right about one thing. The law is clear. The question is, does his client actually follow it?" A flicker of irritation crossed Sterling's face. Jared continued. "I've spent the last 6 months studying every case, every statute, every loophole that banks and corporations use to strip homes away from families. And I found something." Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Something?" Jared nodded. "Yes, and it changes everything." Sterling let out a quiet laugh. "Oh, this should be good." Jared ignored him. Instead, he turned to the judge. "Before I begin, Your Honor, I'd like to submit an official request for discovery, because I have reason to believe the plaintiff is hiding something. The courtroom shifted. Judge Grayson sat forward, his expression less amused now. Hiding what, Mr. Calloway? Jared's gaze locked onto Sterling. Fraud. And just like that, the room wasn't laughing anymore. The word fraud lingered in the air like a slow-burning fuse. Sterling's smirk faded, and for the first time, Judge Grayson gave Jared more than just a passing glance. Fraud? The judge's voice carried a note of skepticism, but there was something else beneath it. Curiosity. Jared nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I believe the foreclosure on my grandmother's home was based on forged documents, and I can prove it, if I'm allowed to request full discovery. Sterling let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. Your Honor, this is absurd. A baseless accusation meant to stall the inevitable. The property was seized under standard foreclosure proceedings. Jared tilted his head. Standard? He took a step forward, his voice steady. Tell me, Mr. Sterling, how standard is it for a bank to foreclose on a house when the original mortgage documents have two different signatures from the same person? The courtroom rustled. A few murmurs broke out in the gallery. Sterling's jaw clenched. What are you talking about? Jared reached into his folder and pulled out 2 copies of the original mortgage agreement. He walked over to the bailiff and handed them up to the judge. These are 2 separate copies of the same document, Your Honor. One from the initial filing and one from a later modification. If you look at the signatures, you'll notice they don't match. Judge Grayson leaned in, scanning the papers. His forehead creased. Jared continued. Now, I'm no expert, but I know my grandmother's signature. And that second one? That's not hers. The judge flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from dismissive to focused. He looked up at Sterling. Mr. Sterling, do you have an explanation for this? Sterling cleared his throat. Your Honor, this is an attempt to confuse the issue. Signatures can change over time. Jared didn't let up. Maybe, but that second signature is from a document filed only 3 months after the original. And if you compare them side by side, he pointed toward the papers in the judge's hand, you'll see that not only do they look completely different, but the second one was signed the day after my grandmother was hospitalized for a stroke. A wave of reaction rippled through the courtroom. Even the jury leaned forward. Judge Grayson turned back to Sterling, his tone firmer now. Mr. Sterling, does your client have the original signed documents on file? Sterling hesitated. It was quick, barely noticeable, but Jared saw it, and so did the judge. We would need time to retrieve them, Your Honor. Jared smiled. That's fine. I'll wait. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't just intrigue, it was doubt. But Jared wasn't just here to poke holes in their story. He was here to tear it apart piece by piece, and this was only the beginning. Judge Grayson exhaled through his nose, flipping through the documents again. His eyes flicked between the mismatched signatures, his fingers tapping against the bench. The judge, who had been so sure of Jared's incompetence, now looked interested. Sterling, however, was already trying to regain control. Your Honor, these documents don't change the core of the case. The defendant is grasping at straws, hoping to delay the inevitable. The bank followed the legal process. That's what matters. Jared let the words settle before speaking. Followed the legal process? He let out a small breath, shaking his head. Mr. Sterling, do you even know who your client bought this debt from? Sterling blinked. What does that have to do with anything? Jared turned to the judge. Your Honor, the mortgage was sold 3 times before it landed with the current lender. 3 separate times, but the transfer paperwork. He paused, pulling out another document from his folder and walking it to the bailiff. That's where it gets interesting. Grayson took the papers, scanning them. His jaw tensed. Jared continued. Each time the loan changed hands, it should have been accompanied by an endorsement, an official transfer from one lender to the next. But look closely. Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Grayson's brows knitted together. There's no signature on the last transfer. Jared nodded. Exactly. which means the last company had no legal right to foreclose on my grandmother's home. And the bank that did? They never actually owned the loan in the first place. A hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom. The tension in the air thickened. Sterling sat forward, his voice tighter. Your Honor, this is... Grayson cut him off. This is a problem. Jared took a slow breath. He had them exactly where he wanted them. They had underestimated him, laughed at him. But now, they weren't laughing anymore. But exposing the fraud was one thing. Proving intent was another. And that was where Jared was about to hit them the hardest. Sterling's face had lost its smugness. The confidence that oozed from him at the beginning of the trial was cracking, and Jared saw it. The man who had treated this case like a formality was now scrambling for control. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his tone sharp. Mr. Sterling, I assume your client has an explanation for why this mortgage was transferred without proper endorsement. Sterling hesitated. Your Honor, I would need to confer with my client before making a statement on that. Jared tilted his head. You mean the same client who has been submitting legally questionable documents in multiple foreclosure cases, just like this one? Sterling snapped his gaze toward him. That's an outrageous claim. Jared didn't blink. Is it? Because I took the liberty of researching your client's foreclosure history. Turns out my grandmother's house isn't the only one they acquired under these exact circumstances. Another document. Another piece of evidence handed up to the judge. Judge Grayson skimmed the papers, his expression darkening. He exhaled slowly, looking up at Sterling. This case isn't looking as simple as you suggested. Sterling's jaw tensed, but before he could speak, Jared pressed forward. Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness. Grayson looked at him. A witness? Jared nodded. Yes. The person who notarized the second mortgage signature, the one I believe was forged. A quiet gasp from the gallery. This wasn't just about missing paperwork anymore. Jared was about to bring someone into the courtroom who could unravel the entire case. Sterling stood immediately. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This witness was not disclosed beforehand. Jared turned to him, his voice even. That's because I only just tracked her down yesterday. And what she told me, he let the silence stretch for a beat. Changes everything. Judge Grayson studied him, then turned to Sterling. I'm allowing it. Sterling stiffened. He knew. This wasn't going his way anymore. But Jared's biggest move was still coming. Because the witness wasn't just any notary. She was the one person who could blow the case wide open. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and a woman stepped in. Linda Myers, a notary public, looked tense as she made her way to the stand. She adjusted her glasses, her fingers gripping the railing. Judge Grayson nodded toward her. State your full name and occupation for the record. She cleared her throat. Linda Myers. I'm a licensed notary public. Jared stood, his voice calm but firm. Ms. Myers, do you recall notarizing the second mortgage modification for my grandmother, Alma Calloway? Linda hesitated, glancing at Sterling. I do. Jared nodded. And were you present when she signed the document? Another pause. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face. Sterling shifted in his seat. Jared waited, giving her space. Finally, Linda exhaled. No, I wasn't. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Grayson's gaze sharpened. Jared kept going. Ms. Myers, did you witness anyone else signing on her behalf? She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. No. Jared stepped closer. Then how did the document get notarized? Linda's hands trembled slightly. I was given the paperwork. By a bank representative. I was told it had already been signed, and I just needed to stamp it. Another shockwave through the room. She had just admitted that the signature was notarized without proper verification, making the entire foreclosure process illegal. Sterling shot up from his seat. Objection. This is hearsay, Your Honor. She can't verify the legitimacy of... Judge Grayson held up a hand, cutting him off. Overruled. His tone had lost any trace of patience. He turned to Linda. Ms. Myers, Do you understand the legal implications of what you just said? Linda nodded, her eyes glassy. Yes, sir. I didn't know at the time, but I should have. Sterling sat down, running a hand down his face. He knew it was over. Jared turned back to the judge. Your Honor, given this testimony, the forged signature, and the missing mortgage transfer endorsements, I move to have this foreclosure nullified. My grandmother's home was taken through fraudulent means, and now the evidence is right in front of you. Silence. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, tapping his gavel on the bench. When he spoke, his voice was firm. The court rules in favor of the defendant. The foreclosure is void. The property is to be returned immediately. Jared let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The wait, the fight, the months of endless research, it had all led to this moment. He turned, catching Sterling's hollow stare. The man who once dismissed him as nothing had just been taken down in front of an entire courtroom. But Jared wasn't thinking about him anymore. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. His grandmother's home would not be stolen, not today, not ever. But the lesson here wasn't just about winning a case, it was about standing up, even when no one believes you can. Jared stepped outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the steps. He paused, taking a slow breath. The air felt different, not lighter, not freer, just real. The kind of real that settles in when a fight is finally over. His grandmother's home was safe, that was all that mattered. A few people from the gallery filtered out behind him, their voices hushed. Some whispered about the case, others about him. He caught snippets, words like, never saw it coming, and that man should be a lawyer. But Jared didn't need validation. He never had. What he needed was justice. And today, he got it. A voice called out from behind him. Calloway! Jared turned to see Judge Grayson standing at the top of the courthouse steps, hands in his pockets. The arrogance from earlier was gone, replaced with something more measured. You surprised me in there. The judge's voice wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. Jared met his gaze. You weren't the only one. Grayson studied him for a moment, before giving a small nod. You ever think about law school? Jared let out a quiet chuckle. Not really. Grayson smirked slightly, just for a second. Might want to reconsider. You've got a talent for making people squirm. And with that, he turned and disappeared into the courthouse. Jared exhaled, shaking his head. Law school. Maybe. Maybe not. But one thing was certain. If anyone ever tried to take what was his again, they'd better be ready for a fight. Because power doesn't just belong to the ones with money and titles. It belongs to the ones who refuse to back down. And if this case proved anything, it was this. The underestimated always have the most to prove. And when given the chance, they don't just win, they change everything. If you found this story as gripping as the courtroom did, hit that subscribe button. Because in the real world, the fight for justice doesn't end here.